have you here for this very special event to launch the latest in a series of quite remarkable books by our esteemed and beloved senior fellow colleague, Peter Berkowitz, entitled Explaining Israel, the Jewish State, the Middle East, and America, which gathers together 40 columns that Peter has written in his consistently forthright and insightful column for RealClearPolitics between 2014 and 2024 on what's called the Great Israeli Mosaic, people, opinions, aspirations, and domestic and national security challenges. I think most of you know Peter in one way or another. He's the Tad and Dianne Taube Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where we sit here today. He is also, as I've just explained, a regular columnist for RealClearPolitics, and he serves as Director of Studies for the Public Interest Fellowship. From 2019 to 2021, he served as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff and Executive Secretary of something that I think he had a very formative influence on, the Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, as well as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Peter is a member of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters and a 2017 recipient of the very prestigious Bradley Prize. His previous books are Constitutional Conservatism, Liberty, Self-Government, and Political Moderation, Israel and the Struggle Over the International Laws of War, Virtue and the Making of Modern Liberalism, and Nietzsche, The Ethics of an Immoralist. If you haven't gathered already, Peter is a political theorist and one of the most original and forceful thinkers, and I'd say unconventional and challenging thinkers broadly in the academy. He teaches an extremely popular undergraduate course here. I think it's called Varieties of Conservatism, which many of my students who are not conservatives, as well as others who are, have taken and highly praised. He has also edited 7 collections of essays on political ideas and institutions, and has written, as you might have gathered if you read his prolific RealClearPolitics column, hundreds of other articles, essays, and reviews on a wide range of subjects, from culture to foreign policy. Peter is going to be in conversation here for a while with my new-ish colleague, Amichai Magen, who I'm very pleased to announce is now the director of our permanent Israel Studies program over at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. We're very honored and pleased to be able to have this joint event between the Hoover Institution and the Israel Studies program, and I'm quite confident it won't be the last time that these two great organizations are collaborating. So I'll join you here as a kind of voyeur and occasional interlocutor, but it's really an honor and a joy to be with both of you. And Amichai, I'll hand it over to you to guide us through the conversation with Peter.
Thank you so much, Larry. And Peter, congratulations on another beautiful book, very rich and textured and accessible. Before we start, I want to thank 2 individuals in particular. Is Amy Alonso here from the Hoover Institution? Is Amy here? If not, the Hoover folks, please convey our thanks to Amy, who's teamed up with someone I do know is here, and that's our program manager in the Israel Studies program at FSI, Aliza Schonenberg. Thank you so much, Aliza, for working so brilliantly with Amy to put this beautiful event together. And thanks everyone for gathering. So to provide a little bit of a roadmap to this evening, I'll pose some questions to Peter, and Larry, feel free to kibitz and come in and pose some questions from your side. We'll do that for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to a conversation with you. I believe there's some floating mics, right, Aliza? There's some mics around, or if not, we'll find a way for people to pose their questions, and then we'll have a nice reception outside to which you are all cordially invited. So I think we'll start from the general, and we'll kind of hone into some of the key themes of the book. So the first impression that I had reading this book, and this is something that's quite rare, I think, for commentators who write in English, is that Peter Berkowitz is someone that you can tell from the writing is really vested in Israel, not only emotionally, but he's someone who actually knows the place. I can say that as an Israeli. That's actually quite a rare thing. He travels to Israel regularly. He speaks the language kacha kacha, as we say, comme si, comme ça. There's still a little bit of work to do on his accent, but we try, right, Peter? We're working on the Hebrew. And when you read the collection of essays, you see that he is in regular conversation with some of Israel's most influential and original public intellectuals and thinkers. There are essays here where Peter engages with Ari Shavit, with Micha Goodman, with Yossi Klein Halevi, even with Gadi Taube, right, which is an interesting experience all in itself. So reading this, you get a sense that Peter writes about a real Israel, that he lives intellectually and emotionally. And I don't think that's to be taken for granted, even for someone such as yourself, Peter, who has a Jewish heritage and a Jewish background. So my first question to you is, why the fascination? When did it start? How did it evolve? And why does it continue? The old joke, an Israeli says, I don't have a choice. I'm Amichai Magen. I have to engage with Israel. But you have a choice. You can engage with other things. Why this enduring fascination with Israel for you?
Well, the answer is a long story. I'll make it a little shorter, but not before I say thank you to you, to Larry, the Hoover Institution, and the newly established Israel Studies program for hosting the event. It's true, yes, I made a choice. I grew up in a home in which we knew we were Jewish, but we were not observant, did not have a rich Jewish education. I knew that Israel was important. I didn't know much about it. Studying in college, I came to an appreciation of the treasures stored up in the past, within Western civilization, within my own heritage. That is, I learned that such treasures existed, but I didn't know much about them. And I conceived a plan to have an adventure after college. I traveled to Israel. By traveling to Israel, I could learn about many things. I could learn about the greatest experiment in collective living in the West, the kibbutz. I could learn about farming. I could learn about religion. I could learn about geopolitics. And at the time, I had a tennis coach who had once played the world circuit, and he had landed in Israel about 10 years before. And he had befriended some people in a kibbutz where he taught tennis. He helped me secure my first job in Israel, which was serving as a tennis coach on kibbutz Niram. For those of you who know, is Otef Aza, right along the border with the Gaza Strip. So I arrived in Israel as a tennis coach. I gave lessons because it was summertime in the desert, the Negev, from 5 to 9. And during the day, I would rise early and travel to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, in the mornings, I would study in a yeshiva. What's a yeshiva? It's It's a school where sacred Jewish texts are taught by the ultra-Orthodox, at least the yeshiva I went to. And I got a very early lesson in the divisions within Israel. I was ignorant, but you didn't have to know much to already sense in my first few weeks there that the kibbutzniks had a certain hostility to the very religious, and the very religious had a certain hostility to the kibbutzniks. After a month or so, after the rabbis in the yeshiva repeatedly would ask me why I don't stay after lunch, why I don't live in the yeshiva, I was young, foolish. I blurted out, well, going back to the kibbutz where I'm living. And the look of horror on their faces, in my experience, it was probably only surpassed by the look of horror on the faces of my kibbutz friends when I explained to them where I would go during the daytime. So this relatively quickly enabled me to understand that extraordinary of a country as I thought Israel to be then, and I continue to believe it to be today, it was then, back in the 1980s, rent by serious fundamental divisions. Serious fundamental divisions from which I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn from the kibbutzniks, and I did. I wanted to learn from the ultra-Orthodox, and I did. And I continue to do my best to learn from both, even as I also learn from the division that remains, maybe it's deeper today, between them. So that's the start.
Okay, great. We'll get to the questions of changing demographics in Israel and political polarization, etc. But before we do that, I want to delve a little bit into the challenges of writing about kind of a real Israel, which is so rich, and the pace of change and the intensity of the place is so great that in itself, I think, poses a challenge. I remember a meeting I had as a student with the late Shimon Peres, and one of the interesting things that he said is, remember, if you live in Israel for 75 years, it's like living for 200 years in any other country, because the pace and the intensity are just kind of extraordinary, and capturing that in writing and conveying that, to an audience. Another friend, Ron Dermer, likes to joke that Israelis go to Manhattan to unwind, right? I mean, it's a really, really, really intense place. And yet, when you read the essays, there's something enduring about them. So, could you kind of help us to understand, how do you write effectively about a country that is transforming at an incredible pace, where there are 1,000,001 different varieties of political thought, all interacting with one another, and translating that reality to an English-speaking audience? If I may, just to kind of explain what I mean by this, already in 1976, in a beautiful little book called To Jerusalem and Back, the Nobel laureate in literature, Saul Bellow, observed that there wasn't one Israel. There were actually two Israels. The first Israel was the real Israel, which was sort of territorially insignificant little place where real men and women lived their lives, right? But Saul Bellow said there's a second Israel. And that second Israel is a fantasy land of biblical proportions upon which everyone in the world and their auntie project their pet neuroses, and they have very firm opinions about, especially if they have never been there, right? And Saul Bellow described that second Israel, this is a beautiful quote, as broad as all history and perhaps as deep as sleep itself. Right? Beautiful kind of description. how do you write about those two Israels? How do you write about the real Israel, understanding that everyone projects their own story, their own narrative on Jerusalem, sees Israel and views Israel as almost a mirror upon which or through which you analyze kind of your own society, whether you're in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere. Does that present a challenge that you face?
Yes, and I want to approach this by telling a quick story. When I was a young assistant professor, I was invited to lunch early on by a brand new graduate student. He was an older graduate student. I was a younger assistant professor, about the same age. He had converted to he was born Jewish. He had become an observant Jew in college, and he arrived as a graduate student with a wife and infant baby. He was 26 at the time. This was, by historical standards, not young, but by graduate school standards, still noteworthy. And over lunch, he'd been at the university for a week. Over the lunch, he explained to me his plans to complete his coursework in 2 years, then go to Israel, write his dissertation there, and while he was writing his dissertation, launch his dream of creating Israel's first liberal arts, private liberal arts college. It would be a liberal arts college devoted to both the classics of Western civilization and the sacred books of the Jewish tradition. A long, wonderful lunch. And as I was walking home that Shabbat afternoon, I thought to myself, this new guy, he's very talented, but this is a bit crazy. He hasn't taken his first class, and yet he's dreaming about establishing this first college. It only took me a few more steps to remind myself, if there hadn't been talented, eccentric, slightly crazy people like this fellow Dan Poldazar, who 30 years later created Israel's first private liberal arts college devoted to both sacred Jewish books and treasures of Western civilization, if there weren't people like that combined big dreams with the ability to get things done, there'd be no Jewish state in the land of Israel. So first lesson, let's not divide too sharply between nitty-gritty reality and dreaming. They're, as you know, integrally related in the land of Israel. The title of my book actually comes from several conversations I had in Israel in December 2023. In other words, about 2 months after the massacres of October 7th. And even though, as Amichai said, I'm a frequent visitor to Israel, typically about 4 times a year, many people I saw looked at me with surprise, and they said, what are you doing here? And I found myself responding, Batile sof deot, I have come to collect opinions, to listen. So an editorial comment, I think that listening is a dying art, but do your best to revive it, because wonderful things, you can learn wonderful things if you're patient and you give other people an opportunity to express their opinions. Now, listening is also an active enterprise. It helps at the right moments to put useful questions that are not intended to stump, but questions that are intended to help your interlocutor explain to you what you're seeking to understand. So as Amichai mentioned, I've had the opportunity to sit with, talk to, read the writings of an extraordinary range of people, and try to understand what's most important to them, and to see also another feature of the columns, a little longer than the typical weekly column. I also try to put the conversations, put the issues in a somewhat larger historical context. Helps me organize my thoughts, and I think it can be useful to others.
Well, great. Well, let's dive into the book, and maybe I could give people a sense of the scope of the book. I mean, it's really a time journey across a decade, a remarkable decade for Israel, 2014 until 2024. I think it's difficult to find a decade in Israeli history that's not remarkable, but this was really a very special decade with extraordinary highs and extraordinary lows. You start with an Israel that has emerged strongly out of the Second Intifada, the Second Lebanon War, an Israel that traversed the global financial crisis with incredible success. The Israeli economy just boomed through. Israel navigated the Arab Spring of 2011, 2012, and by 2013, the Morsi government in Egypt is gone, the old guard is back, and Israel is booming economically. That was like a really Mickey Mouse version of the run-up to the starting point of your story. And then you end in October 2024 with the discussion of Ari Shavit's book, which has so far only been published in Hebrew. It's called Milchemet Kiyum, or Existential War, in which Ari Shavit analyzes the failures of the October 7th multi-front war and proposes a new strategy for Israel's future. By the way, we interviewed Ari Shavit about the book for the Israel program last year, and if anybody wants to access that conversation, it's an hour and a half conversation with Ari about the book. So a very tumultuous decade, and perhaps we could start by talking about domestic politics in Israel. I tend to think that, you know, when you ask people what's the rarest element in the Middle East, some people would say water, others would say peace is the rarest element. But in my experience, the rarest element in the Middle East is Western understanding of political culture of the Middle East. I think Americans in particular don't really like to deal with political culture. They find it a bit scary, difficult to measure. And so I want to ask you about this, because I think one of the great features of the book is that you're not shy in dealing with thorny questions of political culture and political divisions within Israeli society. So let's begin with this, Peter. What is the Peter Berkowitz guide to understanding Israeli politics on one leg, al regel achat, as we say, right? If you have to explain to a Stanford undergraduate the main differences between American political culture, the American political system, and the Israeli system, based on your experience, how would you do it al regel achat, on one leg?
That's a good question. How about this way? Let's start with two declarations of independence. One, the United States, 1776. The second, Israel, 1948. The American Declaration of Independence announces separation from Britain, of course, and it appeals to, Larry mentioned, kindly thank you, unalienable rights, inalienable rights, natural rights, human rights, rights that inhere in all persons, and asserts that the primary task of government is to protect these rights. And we create a political order that is, rests on democratic legitimacy, the consent of the governed. And a lot of American politics, if we think, it's abstract for the moment, is about reconciling the tensions between protecting individual rights and giving expression to majority will. The Israeli Declaration of Independence has those elements as well. It appeals to rights that all human beings share. You'd say more about that if you wish. And it also affirms that all citizens will be treated equally, this country, this new country of 1948. But there is an important difference. Israel is to be a Jewish state. So imagine taking all the challenges that we face in reconciling the claims of individual liberty and democratic will. Israel's got all of that, but it's also got to reconcile with those challenges that of being a Jewish state. What is it to be a Jewish state? Turns out that's a controversial question. Israelis are quite divided on what that means, beginning with, does that signify a nation? Does that signify a religion? Does that now signify a cultural identity? Don't need to decide that to answer Amichai's question. There's no doubt that the Declaration commits Israel to rights that the state doesn't grant, but rights rather that the state is obliged to assure, maintain rights that the state is established on. That's language taken from the Declaration. And there's no doubt that the country is dedicated to democracy. So, Israel and the United States are alike, and they must balance freedom and democracy. They are different in that Israel must also weaves into that mix the responsibility to be a Jewish state. On one leg, now we can have a long, sometimes difficult conversation about what that reconciliation has looked like, where it's gone well, where it's gone badly, where it's gone very badly, and where things stand today.
Right.
Al-regel achat.
Right, al-regel achat. I think one of the main features of the decade that you write about is this gradually dawning realization for many Israelis that we have moved away from being a society and a polity that was majoritarian in the sense that you had some kind of cohesive shared Israeliness that was Jewish and democratic, that combined a great sense of patriotism and Zionism on the one hand, with a desire to be an open society, a liberal society, and to belong to the community of the West. Israel in 2010 achieved this remarkable milestone of joining the OECD, the club of advanced, prosperous democracies. And I lived in Israel throughout almost all the period that you write about. And I would say that from about 2016, 17, you begin to see this kind of shift in attitude and different groups in Israeli society beginning to get a sense that we were no longer this kind of cohesive society, but we were fragmenting into what Ruby Rivlin, the former Israeli president, described as Arbaat HaShvatim, the four tribes, right? The religious, the secular Israeli Arabs, the settler movement, and there was a sense that Israel was fragmenting, and remarkably, that sense of what we call sometime in the political science literature polarization or toxic polarization hasn't really gone away in the aftermath of October 7th and the war. The latest public opinion polls that we have in Israel show that Israelis today are even less united, more divided over these critical issues of what does it mean to be a Jewish and democratic state, and that a lot of this is really driven by a shift in the demographic balance in Israel, where the society is becoming proportionately more religious and in some respects ultra-Orthodox. And in your book, you really focus on how that changing demographic and social reality has really come to a head over the issue of what, and Israelis can't even agree on what to call this. There are those in Israel who call it the legal overhaul, and those who call it the regime coup. ההפיכה המשטרית, in trying to describe what the current coalition government is trying to do in terms of strengthening executive power at the expense of pre-existing checks and balances, and especially the legal establishment of the State of Israel. How serious is this rift? And do you see Israelis being able to renegotiate the social contract and perhaps have some kind of a new constitutional moment that will keep Israeli society together?
Well, that's a big challenge. Let's start with this. It's true that the polarization in Israel has intensified, greatly intensified, over the decade that I was writing about. But polarization is not new. The polarization was hidden at the beginning from the dominance of one political party, and one cultural elite, the labor elite. But from the beginning in Israel, there were deep tensions, as you know, between the majority and the ultra-Orthodox, to say nothing of the tensions between the Jews of the land of Israel and the Arab minority population, the citizens of Israel, who were granted equal rights under the Israeli political system, and tensions between the labor majority and the extraordinary numbers of Jews that Israel absorbed in the wake of the War of Independence. I don't think any country has done something like this. Within 3 years of its birth, Israel doubled its population by absorbing Jews who had been expelled or fled for their lives from countries of North Africa and the Middle East. There, as Amichai knows, the absorption of these Jews, the Sephardi Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, was anything but simple in Israel. They, members of that generation, their children, continue to harbor strong resentments, and I suppose the first important political revolution in Israel occurred in 1977, when Menachem Begin's Likud defeated Yitzhak Rabin. So tensions and splits, as we say, and divisions, there have always been in Israel. But, as Amichai points out, yes, they greatly intensified over the last 10 years. Why? Here's one big factor. There are multiple factors. But you mentioned what Prime Minister Netanyahu's government calls judicial reform, what the opponents call regime change, what I'm going to call, for the purpose of this conversation, a sweeping overhaul of the judicial system. I think that that's fair to, as a preliminary matter, to both sides. Since 2016, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been under investigation by the State Attorney's Office, charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of the public trust. We don't need to go into the details for now, but I do want to mention to you that one of the reporters who first uncovered the scandals, and whether Netanyahu violated the law, that's actually, in my view, a hard question. Whether he engaged in very questionable behavior is not so controversial. He did. In any case, Raviv Drucker is a writer for the left-wing newspaper Haaretz, and a few months ago in an interview, he said, you know, I helped uncover this. He said, I have no doubt that Netanyahu is guilty. But if I had known the consequences for Israel of the investigation that led to an indictment that's led to a trial, I think I would not have published it. What has he meant? I will encapsulate. This controversy with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the center has ripped Israel apart, even before the judicial reform, the sweeping overhaul, excuse me. Israel had divided itself into pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi camps, almost overwhelming the division between right and left, although, as you can imagine, most of the people in opposition, although not all, are conventionally on what we would call the left. Moreover, Netanyahu's rhetoric changed after 2016. Netanyahu, everybody has in Israel, right or left, opposition, supporters of Netanyahu, has regarded him as a political wizard, crafty, some would say brilliant, but a man who knows how to pull rabbits out of hats and win. Well, a strategy that he adopted but after the investigation began, was to further divide Israeli society. This has had terrible consequences because the reaction on the left has not been to, shall we say, turn the other cheek. Both sides have been engaged for almost a decade now in doubling down, intensifying the accusations. They did reach, as Amichai was suggesting, a kind of peak following the January 2023 proposals for sweeping judicial overhaul. So much so that the Prime Minister of Israel was denouncing protesting Air Force pilots. Air Force pilots on whose security Israel essentially depended as anarchists and traitors. Meanwhile, the pilots and their friends in the high-tech community were denouncing Netanyahu as intent on overthrowing democracy in Israel. This is an extremely unhealthy situation for a democracy, as Amichai has already suggested, as you could see for your very eyes, political cohesiveness being shredded. If you had asked somebody, almost anybody in Israel, on October 6th, 2023, do you think Israel is headed for a constitutional crisis? The answer would have been, what are you talking about, headed for a constitutional crisis? We've been in one for quite a while. Question is, how much it's going to intensify. That's on the Friday evening, October 6th. So that was the terrible condition that Israel was in 8 hours before Hamas launched 5,000 rockets at southern Israel, almost every one a war crime, by the way, because directed at civilians, and sent in 3,000 terrorists to butcher civilians.
And some would argue that that division, that very visible division, contributed to the decision-making process of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and potentially could have brought in Hezbollah on October 8th, which in some respects...
I should say, one of the people who would say that is Sinwar himself,
right,
who in communications made just that point.
He said it in the past,
yes, before the Israelis killed him as they were exercising their legitimate right of self-defense, yes.
Yeah. Well, this year, or this coming year, we've just entered, everybody in Israel knows that we're heading to elections, national elections. Whether the elections happen in the winter, less likely. Most likely people are talking about June 2026 as the elections, but at the latest, elections will take place in October 2026. Maybe, Larry, you would want to come in at this point as well. Any thoughts about what those elections would look like, or what would be the defining question placed before the Israeli electorate, and what could be, or what would be the outcome of such an election in your analysis, Peter?
The outcome of the election, I don't know, but I will report this in the summer of, it was probably autumn of 2019. During the period, we were talking about this earlier, 3.5 years between 2019 and November 2022, Israel conducted 5 elections. So this conversation would have taken place as Israel was preparing for the second election. I was in Israel, and I asked an Israeli what he expected to be the outcome. And I heard a reply that I don't think I had ever heard from an Israeli. Ani lo yodea. I don't know. Never before. Never before. There are 3 more elections to go. Don't know what the outcome is, but we can sketch some considerations that will inform the election. First, and Amichai has gestured at this, it is the mood in Israel. What's the mood in Israel? There's one day of great elation. It is difficult to convey the significance that the people of Israel have attached to the return of the hostages, living and deceased. It is deep, it is genuine, it is inspiring, and much of Israel, if not all of Israel, is deeply grateful to President Trump and his team. But don't be fooled by that elation. The polarization to which Amichai referred, to which I've discussed as well, runs deep. I'll just give you an example. I was in Israel in late August. I asked many people about the impact on the Israeli mood of the tremendous military accomplishments of June, mid-June, when Israel, capped off by the American strike, Midnight Hammer, when Israel significantly degraded the Iranian nuclear program. And by the way, also its ballistic missile program. I said, what's the impact on the Israeli spirit? People responded as if we would respond if somebody asked us, I know this is a difficult moment in the United States, but surely you're buoyed by America's tremendous victory in World War II. You say, no, not, I mean, it was great as it was. It's as if it had no impact. It's as if this was from decades before. So the next election will in part turn on whether Israel can produce a candidate who can, to some significant extent, overcome the terrible divides. We could go through the various candidates. I think that's probably not the best use of our time here. I want to go back to an earlier comment I made while standing on one foot. So here's what a candidate would look like who actually could rally, bring together what I believe is still a pro-Zionist majority in Israel, one that I believe is not reflected in the Knesset. All that person would have to do, is speak about Israeli politics in a way that recognized that Israel was simultaneously the nation state of the Jewish people, a nation state that protects individual rights, and a nation state that governs itself directly, and recognizes that every citizen has some sort of stake in this. In other words, a politician who did not see advantage in division, but actually saw division in reknitting what has been torn apart. Now, lest I be accused of a dreamer, which I've already said would not be a terrible thing in the Israeli context. Obviously, politicians have seen that there's benefit. They have an interest in sowing division. But I think there's a chance that instead of sowing division, reknitting what is unraveling could be experienced as a novelty, catch people off guard, and benefit the country.
Okay. So half the book kind of deals with these questions of political culture, institutions, the fissures, the constitutional debates, political culture, but the other half deals with what we would conventionally call foreign policy, although in Israel the distinction between domestic and the external is also not a neat one. You have essays in the book about Iran, about Syria, about Lebanon, quite a few about the Palestinian dilemma, especially towards the end of the book, you also engage with prospects for a new regional infrastructure that would give expression to, I think, what has been another profound and mainly invisible transformation in the Middle East, and that is that the Middle East today is no longer divided between Jews and Arabs, it's divided between extremists and moderates. And that gives us the possibility to, and we see this with Trump's 20-point plan, that it contains all the elements of the possibility of normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, the possible conclusion of some kind of security plus deal with Syria. Who would have thought that would be possible? There are fascinating voices coming out of Indonesia, coming out of Lebanon, about the possibility of normalizing relations with Israel. So a lot of regional and foreign policy issues to unpack, and I'm sure we're going to get some questions about them. But let's pick a couple. Iran, okay, Iran. Iran we'll both agree it's down but not out, right? So Iran has received a very significant blow to its capacities to inflict real damage on Israel. You mentioned the nuclear program, just as important, the ballistic missiles program. So Iran's capacity has been at least temporarily diminished, but not its motivation. I think we could all safely say that Iran's motivation to harm Israel today is probably very, very high. And we see now that Iran is seeking to rebuild its ballistic missiles capabilities, to restore its air defense system. Are we heading towards another round of Israeli-Iranian confrontation?
Short answer is very likely. President Trump spoke incorrectly a few weeks ago when he was in Israel. But I'm giving one example here. So, when he said in the Knesset that this long and difficult war has ended. And two mistakes. One is that he was referring to the war between Israel and Hamas. I think that's a mistake because it's really, Israelis do this too. It would be more accurate, I believe, to speak of the battle between Israel and Hamas, recurring battle, which is part of a long war that the Islamic Republic of Iran has launched against Israel. By the way, it is a multi-front war. In the weeks following the October 7th massacres, we were talking about a 7-front war, which involved Gaza, Hamas in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran-backed Assad in Syria, Iraqi militias, the Houthis in Yemen, and of course the head of the octopus, Iran. So Israel has done a stunning job. I believe Israel's military operations will go down in the annals of military history, especially from around July 2024 through June Operation Rising Lion. That said, as Amichai says, Iran is down but not out. Ayatollah Khamenei just the other day said the nuclear program is just fine. We know that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, hardliners there, believe that the lesson to be learned from the setbacks they've incurred was that they were wrong to proceed slowly toward a nuclear weapon, that they need to intensify the pace. And another something that's very important in understanding the constellation of forces here, and in Gaza as well. The Trump administration undertook a negotiation amazingly included 8 Arab and Muslim countries, including Turkey and Indonesia. The negotiations also included Hamas. And what has been arranged so far is a ceasefire that has not held. And the Trump administration has launched, by the way, I don't think we've fully processed the, I'm going to use a non-technical term and not from political science, I don't think we've fully appreciated the weirdness of the Trump administration sending first the president, then the special envoys, then the vice president, then the secretary of state, and then setting up a military command in Israel, staffed by Central Command officials, approximately 15 miles from Gaza, which makes it 17 miles or so from the front lines of the war. In other words, the United States is now, the Trump administration is now engaged in nation building in the Middle East. Extraordinary. Here's a problem, though, with actually the beautiful plan that Jared Kushner, with the help of Tony Blair and the help of your friend Ron Dermer, drafted. Actually, my own view is that for the most part, from Prime Minister Netanyahu's view, it's a terrific plan. Some critics have said this was foisted upon Bibi. I don't think so. Why? If the plan were to be implemented as written, Netanyahu would secure all of his principal war objectives. Hamas would be, according to the plan, it's going to be disarmed. Gaza Strip will be demilitarized. The population will be de-radicalized. A technocratic government made up of Palestinians with no connection to Hamas or the Palestinian Authority will govern Gaza. Terrific. And the hostage is released. Now the living hostage has been released. That's happened. All the rest, Netanyahu accomplishes his goals without any more fighting. What if the plan is not implemented? Well, it will not be implemented because Hamas continues to seek to rearm, recruit more fighters, and regain control over the Gaza Strip. Then Netanyahu can return to fighting, but this time he doesn't have to be careful to protect the lives of Israel's hostages. Why do I think Hamas is not going to allow the United States, the 8 Arab and Muslim countries, and Israel to get beyond phase 1? Because of the way in which Hamas actually responded to the original overture from the Trump administration. Hamas published a statement on October 3rd, I think it was, saying, we appreciate President Trump's efforts to end the war on Gaza. To end the war on Gaza. It's very significant to put it that way. It's not just that implies that this war is a war of Israeli aggression on the people of Gaza Strip. And it's not only that that's false. In this war, Israel is exercising its right of self-defense against Hamas. There's more. Hamas declared war on Israel in 1988 when it published its charter, still available wherever you can find the internet, in which Hamas makes very clear its mission is to plant the flag of Allah on every inch of the land of Palestine. No Jewish state. I should say the ratification of the Jewish state. For those of you who are knowledgeable about such matters, check out the 2017 Hamas revision of the 1988 charter. It does not renounce this mission. So when Hamas effectively said, thank you, President Trump, for restraining the Israelis, we don't understand your plan to involve compelling us to renounce our determination to destroy Israel. So crafty as they may attempt to be, we are already seeing. There's plenty of news coverage about Hamas's efforts to regain control, to say nothing of their killing of Israeli soldiers. So I am sadly pessimistic that even this front in Iran's war against Israel is going to be one in which Israel can cease fighting in.
Larry.
I want to ask one of the more existential questions. There are so many ways of framing the existential challenges that Israel face, and it has to do with something that people have been talking about and wrestling with for decades, which is the coexistence between three dimensions. The dimension of Israel as a Jewish state, the dimension of Israel as a democracy, and you've spoken very eloquently about the convergence and the tension between them, and the dimension of whether Israel will be greater Israel, and what ultimately happens to the West Bank and Gaza. And of course the argument is, which many people in Israel and many people outside Israel have been worried about, is that if Israel becomes, well, literally of course, but even de facto indefinitely greater Israel, then the argument is if the Palestinians have no rights within territory that they are then permanently a part of, is Israel still a democracy? So I want to ask a two-part question. How do you view that kind of triangular tension? And is there any possibility any longer of some outcome in which the Palestinians will either have a state or some eventual possibility of effective autonomous governance that would eliminate the possibility of Israel no longer being able to be, by one conception, a democracy?
Nothing but hard questions around here. Thanks. Seriously, because it's a very important subject, and I do want to address it. The best book that I know on this subject, Milkut 67, Catch 67, Bicha Goodman, published around 2017, I think analyzes the tensions, the tragedy very well. What I'm about to say is drawn from his analysis. He begins like this. He says, the left is right. If Israel faces an existential threat, if it does not withdraw from Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, why? If it doesn't withdraw, then there are only two possibilities. Eventually, the now almost 3 million Palestinians live there, become part of Israel. And if that happens, Israel can make them citizens, but then it's going to cease to be a Jewish state, one of the three dimensions I highlighted, because almost half of Israel will be Arab, and just as a political matter, in practice, will lose its Jewish character. If those 3 million Palestinians become citizens and are not given full rights, it will lose its character as a free and democratic country. And that would be a tragedy if you believe, as I do, that Israel was constituted as a Jewish state, a free state, and a democratic state. So the left is right. However, the right is also right. That is, if Israel were to withdraw from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, promptly, I can't even say that Islamists would rush in, because Hamas has been a dominant force in the West Bank for for 2 decades now. Why has Mahmoud Abbas not held an election, the president of the Palestinian Authority, since his term ended in 2009? No doubt multiple reasons. One reason, if he did, he'd lose to Hamas. This is what the public opinion polls tell us. Israel cannot exist with an Islamist state in the West Bank which would threaten Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, more than half of the population. We don't have a map here, but check it out on the map. This Islamist state would control high points overlooking huge part of the Israeli population. Well, the left is right and the right is right. But Goodman concludes, both are wrong. Why are both wrong? Because both refuse to recognize the justice in the other's arguments. So what does Goodman recommend? And I follow him in this. He says, first, we need to get over an American malady, but it's a malady that also affects Israeli negotiators, some. And that is to believe that what is needed and needed today is a solution. It's a solution. Goodman says, imagine that you go to the Secretary of Transportation and you say, sir or ma'am, 50,000 people in this country die every year in automobile accidents. I have a way to reduce the number of deaths by 20%. I can save 10,000 deaths a year. And by the way, my policy is both cost-effective and constitutional. Suppose the secretary said to you, well, that's very nice, thank you very much, but I can't allow even a single American to die. Go away. 10,000 is no good to me. You think that Secretary of Transportation's nuts? See? You are sacrificing 10,000 because you want to focus on 10,000. So Goodman recommends we take a similar approach in regard to Judea and Samaria. What would that mean in practice? In practice, it would mean searching for policies that meet two criteria. Policies toward the Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria that improve their freedom and their prosperity and are consistent with Israeli security. You say, well, what about a state? You say, unfortunately, the conditions do not exist, and this is part of the puzzle I haven't mentioned. A big reason they don't exist is because the Palestinians keep rejecting offers of a state. They were offered a state, can't go through the details right now, but on roughly 95% of the West Bank in 2000, they rejected it, launched the second Intifada. The Bush administration, working with Prime Minister Olmert, offered the Palestinians on even 96, 97% of the West Bank. They rejected it. 3 months later, Israel was forced to undertake the Operation Cast Lead to stop rockets coming in from Gaza. The Obama administration tried for 5 years, 2009, 2014. George Mitchell, Special Envoy, Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary of State Kerry, when those operations, those efforts failed, with again generous offer, Israel was once again forced to enter into Gaza. All those efforts at peace failed, I believe, because this is a contentious point I recognize. If I had more time, I believe I could defend it, because many Palestinians do not seek a state to live side by side in security with Israel. They seek a state that covers all the land between the river and the sea. Even ignorant American college students are chanting this Palestinian slogan. And, by the way, we shouldn't forget this. They demand the honoring of what they call a right of return, which, again, if I had time I could make the argument, has no foundation in international law, which would allow the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of Arabs who fled the land of Israel during the 1948 war to return to Israel. By the way, just a footnote, there is no people in the world except for the Palestinians that any important part of the international community recognizes as having the ability to pass on refugee status. And by the way, there were also much greater exchanges of population after World War II, not least India, Pakistan. So, but still, even if you were to agree with me that that a major reason that Israel faces this existential dilemma is because of Palestinian determination to have it all, that wouldn't change the fact that Israel still faces this existential problem. So, let's look for reforms in the meantime until both countries get leadership. Find ways to sit down and have serious conversations. Let's find policies, separate the populations more, provide more freedom and autonomy to the Palestinians while preserving Israeli security. Examples, just a few examples. And you also, this also answers Larry's questions about practicality. Critics of Israel point out, it's true, by the way, that right now the West Bank has been effectively cantonized. What I mean is there are about, I forget the precise number, 168, 170, doesn't matter. Many, many, many separate Palestinian enclaves, towns, villages, cities. Most of those are not contiguous. Not contiguous. That means that to get from one to the other, Palestinians often have to drive through checkpoints, manned, in some cases womaned, by young Israeli soldiers, 19, 20, 21. Terrible for the Palestinians. It's humiliating. Terrible for the young Israeli soldiers who are compelled to be humiliators. Terrible for everybody. What if you did this? What if you constructed a system of roads, bridges, and tunnels that connected these 168 or so villages, towns, and cities? Only Palestinians have access to them. They also can't exit them into Israeli-controlled areas. Is this ideal? No. Would it improve the quality of lives of Palestinians? Sometimes a 15-minute car ride to visit the cousins takes 3 hours. I imagine that produces resentment, to say nothing of the humiliation passing through the checkpoints and going. So you reduce the 2.5 or 3 hour car ride to a 15-minute car ride. So here's something we know how to do, and Saudis know how to fund. Build roads, build bridges, build tunnels. We know how to do that. We could do that. So I've got a list of other such suggestions. And by the way, if we ever reached a time in which the Palestinian people were more amenable, and yes, if the Israelis were in a better position to negotiate, well, such a reform would be part of the infrastructure. In other words, this approach, gradual, incremental, let's do what we can under the circumstances, it not only does not undermine the ultimate goal that many people have had, it actually lays some foundation for it.
I think maybe we should go to the audience, but I can't resist just sharing the following, that I don't think you'll disagree. This ain't likely to happen under the corrupt and feckless leadership of the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. The good news is that he's 90 years old. The bad news is that his father lived to 103 and died in an automobile accident. Go ahead.
On that cheerful note.
The other bit of bad news is that we have no idea who's going to succeed Mahmoud Abbas, and that's quite deliberate. Okay, I want to turn and take some questions. I would be remiss if I didn't say that another really wonderful and rich thread in the book really has to do with Peter's continuous kind of meditation about American-Israeli relationships. The way that Israel has played a role in American political culture, the role that America plays for Israelis in terms of strategic reliance, etc. But I will leave that for people to read by themselves. What is our method for taking questions? Do we have? Yeah, we have a floating mic. Fantastic. So let me, yes. Gentlemen, please just briefly introduce yourself and ask a question with a question mark.
Thank you for very interesting conversation. My name is Sergei Sanovich. I'm a fellow here at Hoover. You mentioned separation of powers, referring to judicial reform proposal. My question is about how the legislature and the executive are filled, and specifically about the role of religious parties. Like, looking from this political theorist perspective and American experience, do you think that religious parties can play a constructive role in the future of Israel you are talking about? And maybe a short question to Larry in comparative perspective, because Israel was often, you know, when well-wishers from Europe asked Israel to negotiate with certain Arab countries, Israelis, I think, correctly said that their government is not like yours. It's filled with deeply religious people who see war in a different way, and some of them are corrupt, etc. And now some in Israeli government are deeply religious people who see war in a certain way, etc. So in comparative perspective, how Israeli experience with religious parties, you know, looks when you look at the region broader. Thank you.
So Chofish Dat, freedom of religion, is promised in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and the Supreme Court has an obligation to safeguard freedom of religion. At the same time, there are obvious tensions. Israel's a Jewish state, and each actually, both Judaism and Islam have separate, semi-separate from the state, religious establishments. So matters like marriage are governed by separate religious bodies. So this, yes, this creates all sorts of tensions. That having been said, I don't know of any country in the Middle East in which Jews can practice their Judaism, Muslims can practice Islam, Christians can practice Christianity in relatively great freedom as a routine matter with relatively minimal intervention by the government. Many Jewish Israelis, by the way, are very upset with the established rabbinate, which, as you know, controls family law, governs certification of restaurants for kashrut, for kosher, and also prevents serious public transportation on the Sabbath. But all things considered, if you ask, if you're a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, can you practice your religion in the state of Israel? The answer generally and for the most part is yes. As far as the religious parties go, we have to distinguish between the ultra-Orthodox and the modern Orthodox. And to the extent that the ultra-Orthodox parties joined with the Netanyahu coalition, not all, but a significant segment of the modern Orthodox also have joined the Netanyahu coalition, and they have supported this sweeping judicial overhaul. And the threat there is not just to religious liberty, but to liberty in general. I'll give you just one example, but this has to be understood in context. Israel has, still I think, this is a comparative question, but my educated guess is it has just about the most progressive and activist Supreme Court in the Western world. It was in need of reform, and there were great centrists, even center-left thinkers like Ruth Gavizon and others, Ben-Dror Yamini, who's a lawyer but also a columnist, who insisted reform was necessary. And if the Netanyahu government in January 2023 had proposed, this is a crude way of thinking about it, but let's say 60% of what it proposed, they would have been heroes. They would have reined in, I think, sometimes reckless judicial activism, but respected an independent judiciary. I'd give you just one example of the initial reform and what they should have said instead. Part of this initial reform, the sweeping overhaul, was a proposal for a legislative override. Knesset has 120 members. The original legislative override would have allowed 61 members of the Knesset to override any decision of the Supreme Court. Well, that's to abolish judicial independence. That's just say the majority governs, including in what's the final interpretation of rights and religious liberty. But suppose the Netanyahu proposal had said, I don't know what the magic number is, but let's say a supermajority, 2/3, 75. I wouldn't be surprised if they might have gotten some support from that. I suspect they would not have triggered 9 months of massive protests. Keep in mind, by the way, that here in the United States, we have a judicial override. It's called the amendment process. It's extremely difficult. 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate have to agree, 2/3 of state legislatures, and then 3/4 of the states. It's designed to give an opportunity, but to have a very high bar. If the Netanyahu government had made a proposal in that spirit, it seems to me it would have actually enhanced the separation of powers. But instead, they went from one extreme to another, and that would have endangered, if it had been enacted, in my opinion, it would have endangered rights throughout the country.
Well, let's keep going. Go ahead.
Yes, over there. Yes.
Thank you for what a wonderful analytical discussion that we had today. I'm grateful to be here. And my question is a little bit outside of the direct discussion, so feel free to pass, but it's relevant because it's about the very last comment that you made about the strategic alignment between Israel and US. And the question is in regard with what happened with American universities and how they handled the situation. And I am personally, I'm a graduate of Columbia University in 2016, and this was not something coming for me. Like, I am still in shock and in pain for what happened on campus. And I want to know, with the beautiful way you evidence-based really analyzed everything today, can you comment on that? Can you talk about it in a more analytical way than just all the commentaries that overall we have heard, and none of them really explain the situation? Of whether it was a long time coming or what just happened, really.
I will offer some thoughts, but I need to note that my colleague Larry Diamond sat on a commission for Stanford University, which produced a long and thorough and in many ways disturbing report about the challenge of anti-Semitism here. So I'll offer a few thoughts, then turn to Larry. I think the problem has been, I'm speaking now not specifically about Stanford, Larry's an expert, but in general, for sure at Columbia and other universities, the problem has been welling up for a long time. There has been universities, a significant part of the faculty has taught doctrines that are just highly critical of America. It's fine. Every country is subject to criticism. But verge on, if they don't pass over into anti-American, there's a doctrine of politics and society called settler colonialism, very popular at your university, your alma mater, Columbia University. Not least in the classrooms of a certain, excuse the observation, Professor Mamdani, which teaches settler colonialism, which teaches that the United States is, in our world, the supreme settler colonialist power. That is a country that sends its people to other countries to settle there and conquer the indigenous people. The settler colonialist worldview often emphasizes that there is an outpost of an American-style settler colonialism in the Middle East. It's called Israel, and therefore resistance to Israel is tantamount to, or I should say rather, contributes to the resistance to the wicked United States, which is bent on subjugating indigenous people. This doctrine has been taught, and it inculcates both anti-American and anti-Israel views. Also, I believe our universities are not doing a good job of educating students about other countries, comparative politics. Therefore, I'm delighted by Larry and Amichai's work in creating an Israel Studies program here. But also I have to mention, we also know that significant sums of foreign money have been pumped into American universities, that many of the encampments were driven by a small number of students who received funding and training and pamphlets and guidance from national organizations that themselves received money from abroad, not least the country of Qatar. So a variety of factors have gone into this matter, and my own view is that the antidote on campus is a return to, I won't belabor this, a traditional understanding of liberal education, which makes sure that all students know the fundamentals of the country in which their university is located, the seminal ideas and the great events. This includes highs and lows of Western civilizations, and for sure, the study of other civilizations. In this matter, I stand not only with Larry, but with Aristotle, who said, there's no serious study of politics that is not also comparative politics. Even if my interest were only to understand the United States of America, I would be obliged on this understanding to study other nations and other civilizations to understand better America's strengths and weaknesses.
Which was a point constantly made by a former Hoover, late Hoover Senior Fellow who was my mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset. Amichai, I think maybe we have time for one more question.
I think we have time for one more question, then we'll conclude the formal part of our conversation, and we'll continue over a drink, but not before Peter tells us where we can get copies of the book. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating Peter on the new book and thanking him for a wonderful talk.
Thank you,
Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.